Today we're going to talk about property binding, event binding, and interpolation. These are basically more complicated ways of saying that we're going to discuss how the template in our components talks to the TypeScript file, the class. So I'm going to try and touch on the really basic concepts that we have to work with, and we're also going to work through a bit of an example as well. So to start off with, I've already generated a blank application here, which just has a simple avatar list that we're using. I just copied out the example from the documentation, and so we're going to use this to take a look at some of the concepts. So let's jump into the code to see what we're working with. So I'll open up Sublime here, and I've already got all this open. So we just have the blank Ionic 2 application generated. We have the homepage, which again is automatically generated. So this is what's responsible for rendering out what we're seeing in the browser right now, this blank application with a list and just one single list item. This is just one particular page in our application, and we can have multiple different pages. We have the home page here. We could have some of the shop page and about page, and each page that we have is a component. And so components in Ionic 2, which is the same as in Angular 2, they all look like this. They all have this TypeScript file with a component decorator, which defines the selector, the template, and then they have the template itself, and also a styling file, which is a Sass file that we have here. I'm not going to talk about the styling component in this video. I actually did a video recently where I talked through some methods for styling your application, so I'll link to that from this video. But we're just going to focus on the TypeScript file, the class definition here, and the template file, the HTML file. And so right now this HTML file isn't really making use of this. This sets up the component for us so we can actually use it in our application, but the template here is just doing its own thing. It's just displaying some basic data using some basic Ionic 2 components. So to make this a little bit more interesting, what we're going to do is make this list dynamic. We're going to define some data in our TypeScript file that this is then going to use and loop over so we can display multiple different items. So let's create that in here now. We're going to create an array called, I've got to think of an example. Let's go with employees. So we'll create an employees member variable here. And so this is a member variable or a class member. What this is and why we define it above the constructor here is a variable that belongs to this entire class. So when we're creating our component using this class, that is going to belong to the class as a whole rather than say an individual function. So if I had a function in here, let's call it some function, and I define a variable in the normal way, which is to say let something equal something, or we could do var, var something equals something, which usually we don't use anymore because with the new ES6 syntax in Ionic 2 and Angular 2, let is the better option generally because it uses block scoping, so it limits the scope of the variable to wherever you define it essentially, so we don't run into problems with variables clashing into each other. So the difference between this variable that we create here and a member variable that we create above the constructor is that this is only accessible from this one function, whereas this is accessible from anywhere in this entire class, and it's also available in our template file as well. We can reference that variable in here, which I'm going to get to soon. But I just wanted to make that important clarification there. And if we want to change this value, assign it anywhere within our class here, we can access it through this, which refers to the scope of the class. We can do this dot employees equals whatever. So we can access this from any function in this entire class, and then we can also access that value in the template as well. And we can even set the value in here using the template, using two-way data binding, which again I'm going to get to in just a little bit. So let's take a step back for a minute. We'll delete all this, and what we're going to do is just create an array with a little bit of data in it to define a couple of employees. Okay, so I've defined an array on this .employees now. Sorry for the uncreative data I'm using, but I've just got two people here, Josh, Bob, and Jane, and they have a picture defined that we're going to use for the avatar, their name, and their title. And so we're going to make use of this data in the template. So what I can do is jump over here now, and I can use an ng4 directive. And so what I'm going to do is loop over the ion item here using ng4. And this star syntax that you will see used for stuff like this, it's the structural directive that allows us to stamp out multiple different elements for a set of data. So it's basically a shortcut for creating a template. So what this will do is loop over this element here, this ion item, and it's going to create an ion item for every thing in the set of data that we're looping over, and it's going to stamp out the new information inside of that. So when this is actually output into the DOM, what you actually see when you're looking at it through the browser, it's not going to contain this ng4 or any of the things we're writing here. It's going to generate the templates using Angular. So we're going to do ng4, and we're going to let employee of employees. So we're looping over employees, and we want to reference an individual employee in our data down here, and then we can use those values in here. So just for now, I'm going to set this to be their name, and to do this I'm going to use the concept of interpolation. And what this does essentially is this is where we can use any variables we have defined in our class here, and it's going to calculate whatever value that is and then turn it into a string and render it out here. So if I do employee.name, that's going to go and grab the name for an individual employee, which is Josh, and it's going to put that out as a string here. So we can use any variables, any member variables we have defined in here, we can just reference directly in an interpolation with the curly braces here. I'm going to do the same with their title underneath, and save that and see if it works. And of course it doesn't work because nothing ever works the first time. Let's see what's going wrong. 3 E's for employees. Let's try 2. Okay, there we go. Now we have a list. We have the 3 people that we set up in our array are now displaying in the list. And let's just get rid of the padding on the content too, because that looks a bit silly. Okay, cool, that's a bit better. So we have our data being rendered out using interpolation now, and just before we move on from that, you can also use interpolation to do other calculations, like simple mathematics, for example. I could do 3 plus 5 inside of curly braces, and then it's going to display 8 in here. So most of the time you're just going to be using this to render out some data, but perhaps you might run into a circumstance where you want to make use of that and essentially run some code inside of your template. So one thing I've skipped over doing on purpose is adding in the image here. And because I'm using the same link, I'm just going to delete this for now. Cool, so you can see that the image is gone now. So what we want to do is use the image that we have defined in our data here. We want to put that in here. And so you could do use interpolation again here. You could do your curly braces and add in employee.name, not name, so it should be picture. Save that. And we have our picture back now. I guess the proper way to do this would be to use property binding here, and that's what I mentioned at the start of this video. And what that does is allows us to bind a variable we have to a property on the DOM. So to do that, we can use square brackets here, and this is what allows us to bind the property to the DOM element, the DOM property here, which is source. And if we just write employee.picture, that'll use that variable and add it to the source property here. So if I save that, we should still see our picture being added, and we can. So this isn't just for source, of course. You can use this to bind to many different properties, or any property really. And the reason we use the square brackets here is because this is what will actually turn this value into a string. It'll first figure out what that string should be and use that rather than using employee.picture directly. So if I was to get rid of these square brackets here and save it, it's going to break our image. So if I look over in the console here, I can see it's trying to literally grab employee.picture as the picture, which of course isn't what we want. We want to convert that variable, which is in here, or rather it's an object in array in this case, but essentially we want to grab that and then turn that into a string and then use that rather than literally using employee.picture. So I'll change that back. And then you can use that in other circumstances as well. So a common one, for example, to use is hidden. So there is a hidden attribute we can use. So if I say hidden equals true and take a look at what happens, you can see that the image no longer gets shown anymore. It's being hidden. So I might want to, instead of setting that to either true or false, I might want to base that on some value I have in my TypeScript file here. So if I was to add another property to the objects here, let's say show picture, I'll set this to true for me, and I'll set it to false for Bob, and I'll set it to true for Jane. So now we have different values for different people here. So now if I come in here and add those square brackets to bind one of these properties to this attribute here, this property, if I change that now to employee.showPicture, save that and take a look at what happens, you can see now that it's not showing for me and Jane, but it is showing for Bob. Now I've actually kind of got that a bit backwards. That's confusing. A better name for that variable would be hide picture, because we're deciding whether or not to hide it, not to show it. This doesn't really matter, but just to make it a little bit less confusing, we'll change that to hide picture. And now we want to hide it for me and Jane, but not for Bob. And of course that's what happens. It shows for Bob, but not for me and Jane. So that is property binding. We've already covered interpolation as well. So the main thing we have left to discuss is event binding. And what event binding does is allow us to bind onto events from the DOM and then create handlers for those in our TypeScript file here. So if I wanted to add, say, a click event to this item here, and then perform some action when that happens, I can use event binding to do that. So before we add a click handler here, we're going to convert this into a button with the ion item styling. And the reason we do this is because on mobile, buttons and anchor tags don't have the tap delay. So by converting this to a button, we get rid of that tap delay. You can also add the tappable directive to get rid of that tap delay as well, but it's better for accessibility reasons to use buttons and anchor tags in general when things need to be tapped with, interacted with. So we'll save that and make sure nothing has broken. Everything still seems fine. So what I want to happen now is I want to call a function when that is tapped or clicked. So I'm going to create that function in here, and I'm just going to call it handle click. And when that happens, I'm just going to log out to the console and say I've been clicked. So to trigger that function in our template, we can use an event binding. So I'll add to the button here these two parentheses, and then we use the name of the event that we want to bind to. So in this case, it's just click, and we set that to be whatever the name of our function is. So handle click. And so whenever this button is clicked now, that's going to call this function and run the code inside of there. So if I switch back into the browser, try clicking on something, you can see now it renders out I've been clicked into the console whenever any of these are clicked. As well as that, you can also pass in some data to that function. So if I want to pass in the employee value, so I know who's been clicked on, I can just write employee here. Because I'm using the ng4 directive here, I'm setting up that reference to employee. I can pass that into the click function as well. And you can do that anywhere inside of here. So if I save that again and jump back into here, actually first we want to make sure we are handling that here. And we'll log out the employee object. Okay, so now if I click on myself here, it still says I've been clicked, and then it outputs the object as well. So this is useful for things like, say, a master detail pattern, where you want to detect when somebody clicks on a specific item, and then you want to display more details for that item in a new page. So this would allow you to easily pass this object into a new page and then display that data. And as well as the click event, you can also bind to essentially any DOM event that is available. So this is a really simple syntax to handle attaching listeners to events. Now the final concept I want to cover is two-way data binding. And so what two-way data binding does is allow you to set up a variable where if you change it in the template, it's going to be changed in the TypeScript file automatically in your class here. And if you change it in the class, it's going to automatically be updated to be reflected in the template as well. Okay, so to show you how two-way data binding works, I'm actually going to get rid of this example completely here. And we're going to grab an input from the Ionic 2 documentation. So I've got the inputs up here. We're just going to grab, we'll grab this one. We really only just need the one field. So we'll just use the username for now. So if I save that and jump into here again, you can see we have our username field here. I can type in there and nothing much is happening right now. So what I can do though is set up two-way data binding on this using ng model. And so first we're going to create a variable in here that's going to, we're going to use the two-way data binding on. So we're just going to call this username. And then we can set that up using ng model, using this syntax here with the parentheses inside the square brackets, and set that equal to the variable we just created, the member variable here. So now that is attached to that. So if I was to set this to, we'll set it to Joshua Maroney. If I save that now and jump back into here, so we're actually going to have to get rid of this value here, which is setting the value to blank. But once I get rid of that and take a look, you can see that the username is now being displayed here. So this obviously allows us to use this variable here. But we could do the same thing using interpolation. But the important thing to note is that not only is this grabbing the value from the TypeScript file and putting it in here, if we make a change to this in the template, it's also going to be reflected against this, this member variable here. So if I create a button now, for example, I'm going to add another click handler here again. And we're going to call a function called submit user. And we're not going to pass any data into that. We're just going to also add the ion button styling. And we're just going to call this save. And we're going to create a function here that is just going to log out some information for now. So if I save that, jump into here, if I hit that save button, that's going to trigger that function. So what we're going to do now is take a look at what's happening with this username variable. So if I log that out as well, so that should be this .username, because I'm referencing a member variable. So if I click on save now, we can see that it logs out Joshua Maroney, which you'd expect because that's what we set the variable to be. But now if I change this to just Josh and do it again, you can see that it's also updated this variable here, and it's now displaying Josh. And so another example of what you can do with this, let's say if I had another field here called, we'll say employee name, and we use interpolation to render out that username. If we save this and jump over here again, as I edit this, you can see that it's automatically being updated in that H2 field as well. So this two-way data binding essentially allows you to keep a variable in sync between the template and the class definition. Okay, so that's all we're going to cover in this video. I just wanted to touch on the basics for now. I'll probably do some more advanced concepts in the future, but hopefully that clears up how these three basic but really important things work in Ionic 2 and Angular 2, and that's property binding, event binding, and interpolation, and also two-way data binding. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.